Kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks for having me at NZGDC. Thanks to the organisers for putting this all together, and thank you, whether you're in person or online, for taking the time to listen to my talk. I'm going to tell you about my journey, my successes and failures. I'm also going to talk about how myself, my collaborators, and my peers are working to make the world more inclusive, fair, and sustainable using VR. But I don't want you to think that this talk is only relevant to people working in VR, or that the lessons only apply to the VR industry. A more inclusive, fair, and sustainable world, by definition, benefits everyone, and the same ways of thinking that I'm going to be talking about apply across the gaming industry and to the tech industry and to society in general. But before we look to the future, we need to take stock of where we are right now. And forgive me, please, because this is not the rainbows and unicorns part of the talk. This is the hard truths part. It's only by owning up to the injustices of the past and the present that we can build a more just future together. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional tribal territory of the Tongva people in what is now known as Southern California. The Tongva had inhabited this land for some 7,000 years before Europeans arrived, and yet they're still, to this day, denied federal recognition. When immigrants from Europe arrived in North America 250 years ago, none of them could have imagined that the United States would turn into the global superpower that it became. And none of that superpowerdom would have been possible but for the land that those immigrants took from the indigenous peoples and the abundant resources that that land happened to offer. But stolen land and resources are not the only reasons that the United States became the richest country in the world. Long before Silicon Valley or even Wall Street, the engine of this country's wealth was slavery, as it was in many countries at the time. Free labor tamed the land, built the railroads, picked the crops, etc., enriched the first millionaires. The fact that the descendants of those slaves still have to fight for equality today is a travesty. That they and their allies march, not even demanding a fair share of the wealth that their ancestors suffered and died to build, but just to not be killed by cops, vigilantes, pollution, pandemics simply because of the color of their skin, is an outrage that should offend everyone. You can probably tell from my muddled accent that I'm an expat Kiwi. In New Zealand, we're somewhat proud of being, I guess, the least worst example of colonialism in modern history. The Maori got screwed over, no question, but not as badly as many of the other indigenous peoples that were victims of British and European empire building around the world. I wasn't yet 5 in 1981 when the South African Springbok rugby team toured New Zealand. Kiwis turned out en masse to protest against the tour and the apartheid regime that it represented. I marched down Queen Street in Auckland with my mum, and a few days later the tour was abandoned. Those protests directly contributed to the end of apartheid and the freeing of Nelson Mandela. Of course, South Africa still has a long way to go to achieve racial equality, and let's face it, so does New Zealand. In fact, the massive systemic disadvantages that black and brown people start out with just about everywhere in the world make it that much harder for them to succeed in terms that white people recognize. This leads to underrepresentation of black and brown people in the public perception of conventional success and overrepresentation in negative statistics, all of which in turn perpetuates unfounded prejudice of racial inferiority and laziness. It's a vicious cycle that requires fundamental structural change to address. And that may never happen until those of us who have benefited from white privilege are willing to admit it. So today I want to acknowledge my white privilege. More generally, I want to own up to the fact that the person I am and the things that I've achieved are not mine alone to take credit for. And I challenge all of you to do the same. It's one thing to agree in principle that all people are equal, but it's another thing entirely to internalize the fact that I am here where I am because I've been the beneficiary of unfair advantages. Across billions of years, from the Big Bang to my parents banging, there were a gajillion random events that had to string together exactly as they did for me to even be born. Then I just happened to be born with boy junk to white parents in a first world country, which, let's face it, is kind of like winning some kind of cosmic lottery. Sure, my parents were poor and they got divorced when I was young, but compared to a lot of the Maori and Pacific Island kids in my school, I was doing okay. And compared to kids in the third world, I was born into the lap of luxury with advantages and opportunities they could never dream of. I got to spend my spare time reading science fiction books and watching movies. Through those, I discovered computer graphics and became obsessed with the idea of virtual and augmented reality. I taught myself programming on a hand-me-down Atari, but it didn't occur to me then that a brat from South Auckland could actually end up with a career in computer graphics. Ambition was frowned upon at my school, and the career advisors just weren't equipped to deal with anyone who happened to be burdened with it. After high school, I enrolled by default at Auckland University and signed up for all the most interesting sounding papers. Mostly I studied science, and specifically the science of sci-fi, quantum physics, astronomy, computer programming, and graphics. I went deep down the rabbit hole, and in the end I graduated with an honors degree in the then obscure field of artificial intelligence. Yep, that's right, I was into AI way before it was cool. But it took another amazing stroke of serendipity for that degree to actually pay off. I happened to meet someone on an electronic music email list, who happened to be working for Peter Jackson at Weta Digital. She happened to have lunch with a colleague who happened to be struggling to find people who understood anything about AI. After a few months, I was hired as the second ever user of a piece of proprietary software you may have heard of called Massive. I spent 3 years building brains for orcs and elves and various other fantastical creatures, and choreographing the epic battle scenes on the first two Lord of the Rings films. And as you might imagine, that job set me up pretty well for what turned into a 20-something year career in film visual effects and real-time computer graphics. Yes, I had worked hard to earn my degree, but without that series of lucky coincidences, I definitely wouldn't be here speaking to you today. Some people say we make our own luck. That's actually a very entitled way of looking at things. I mean, I used to believe it because it allowed me to take credit for things that I now know I have very little control over. But if you apply that same logic to the unlucky, then you're suggesting that they bring misfortune upon themselves. And when you think about that a little bit deeper, it's a particularly cruel kind of victim blaming that gives cover to the same racist, classist, and sexist ideas about who's destined to be successful and who isn't. Everyone who succeeds at anything does so through a combination of skill, effort, support, and luck. So I don't feel like it diminishes my accomplishments in any way to recognize that they wouldn't have been possible without an enormous amount of good luck. Nor does it diminish my accomplishments to acknowledge that they wouldn't have been possible without the efforts of hundreds of people who've helped me directly and millions who've helped me indirectly along the way. What it does do when I recognize and when I acknowledge the role of others and of luck in my success is that it diminishes my sense of entitlement. What it does do is remind me to be grateful every single day for my good fortune. That in turn makes me think more about what I can do from my privileged position to help others who are just as smart or smarter, who work just as hard or harder, but maybe haven't been as lucky or as well supported as I have. And look, I definitely haven't always been this, shall we say, magnanimous. I was frankly an entitled little prick when I worked at Weta. I had been completely spoiled by having the first 18 months there be pure R&D playtime. I absolutely loved the challenge of figuring out things that had never been done before, but once we basically worked out how to do it, and we then just had to do it over and over and over, preferably faster each time, I quickly got bored. I guess that was the beginning of my disillusionment with capitalism. Well, the studio was made up of at least 50% Americans at the time, so it was probably the beginning of my disillusionment with America. And George Bush Jr. had somehow won the 2000 presidential election, so I guess it was also the beginning of my disillusionment with representative democracy. More on that later. Anyway, I decided to quit visual effects forever, and instead I moved to Tokyo to try out life as a starving artist. I spent my days getting high, making music, experimenting with interactive flash animations. I played in a Japanese reggae band, made drum and bass music for snowboarding videos, and even tried my hand as a male model. That didn't go as well as you might think, and soon enough I was completely broke. I swallowed my pride, took a job at a Japanese CG studio before moving to San Francisco to work on the Matrix sequels, and then moving to London to work on a whole host of sword and sandal epics. I spent the next several years traveling around Europe and the world, alternately working my way up through visual effects studio hierarchies, and quitting visual effects forever every few years to try my hand at, among other things, being a photographer, science fiction author, comedian, game designer, public speaker, cannabis edibles chef, spoken word poet, etc. All the traveling and spending time with people from different walks of life, living in countries where I was an outsider, trying and failing at all sorts of different creative endeavors, it turned me into the person I am today. I credit that wealth of diverse experience for the humility and compassion that are now at the core of my outlook on life. In 2008, I was living in Havana, trying to immerse myself in the culture and get by as much like a local as possible. I taught a class at the local film school there and was working on a sci-fi novel about a VR esports champion. I'd gone to Havana because the novel I was writing deals with political idealism, and I had this urge to spend time in Cuba while Fidel Castro was still alive. I wanted to see socialism in action and experience firsthand the fortitude of a revolutionary nation united against foreign oppression. But that's not what I saw. I saw a country that's subject to internal oppression as much as external. I saw a country in the grips of an insidious form of shadow capitalism. I was very disillusioned. I got scammed, I got robbed, and I realized I needed to leave. Then, all of a sudden, a visual effects studio in Canada reached out. They wanted to hire me to work on a movie called Invictus about Nelson Mandela and his mission to unite the South African people around the newly integrated post-apartheid Springbok rugby team. How could I refuse? That resonated with me on so many different levels. The next time I quit visual effects forever was to start an indie gaming studio. It was 2012 and the whole world was hooked to their smartphones playing a Scrabble clone called Words with Friends. I was already very focused on promoting fairness by that point, and Scrabble is a game where luck plays a huge influence on the outcome. So I went to war against Words with Friends, released a competing game called Word Skirmish in which luck plays absolutely no part. It wasn't what you'd characterize a resounding success, but it got me comfortable with real-time game engines, and going through that process actually caused me to start a company. So when the Oculus Rift Kickstarter dropped shortly after, I was ready to dive headfirst into the world of virtual reality that I'd been waiting for my whole life. And I tried my hand at everything in VR. I created an API to use your smartphone as a VR controller. I consulted on museum exhibits and music videos. I worked in volumetric performance capture, pitched VR solutions for real estate and construction, made mixed reality games, explored the applications of VR and adult entertainment. But mostly I wanted to tell stories. Eventually I managed to pull together a team and some money, and I wrote and directed an interactive VR short called Downloaded that premiered in 2019 at the Venice Biennale in Italy. I toured the global festival circuit with it, and it was named by Forbes magazine among the top XR experiences of the year. Meanwhile, VR Jam, which was a VR live music startup in the UK that I'd joined a few years earlier, we had reached the technological point where we were actually able to host hybrid physical and real life virtual reality music events. Hybrid physical and virtual reality music events. We were very proud that we could offer increased accessibility to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to attend live DJ events, and we were even prouder that we could help reduce the carbon footprint of live events by hosting them virtually. But we were really struggling to convince investors that there was a market for it. Then 2020 happened. It began with wildfires in Australia, then the Amazon said, hold my beer, then the Arctic said, hold my vodka, California said, hold my margarita, and so on. Storms, floods, heat waves, social unrest, murder hornets. 2020 would have been a contender for the worst year in living memory, even without COVID-19. But pandemic lockdowns around the world suddenly turned virtual events from a novelty into a necessity. Within a couple of months, we'd partnered with the team behind Shangri-La Glastonbury and the VR social platform Sansar to create Lost Horizon, the world's first multi-day, multi-stage virtual music festival. Headliners like Carl Cox and Fatboy Slim allowed us to reach a global audience of millions. Investors like to hear those big numbers, but what matters most to me and my partners in Lost Horizon is building a radically inclusive global community around shared values, promoting action against climate change, and advancing the cause of social and environmental and racial justice. giving voice to marginalized, underrepresented, and otherwise fringe artists. Our unofficial motto is "Don't be a dick," and that mentality is something that we're using our platform to spread to every corner of the globe. We're developing immersive theatre productions and hosting workshops to share the knowledge we've accumulated. Despite everything that's going on in the world, I'm genuinely optimistic. I believe that the climate crisis, along with the racial, social, and wealth inequality crises, all stem from a single bug in society. And if we can fix that bug, we can fix everything. More than that, I believe that we're at a turning point. Everything that's gone wrong this past year and a half, this perfect storm of coinciding shitstorms, has created the conditions for the first time in our lifetimes to enact truly systemic change and usher in a better future for everyone. It's impossible at this moment in human history for anyone to honestly believe that things are going okay. And if everyone acknowledges that things could be better, maybe we can find a way to all work together to make things better. The train has come completely off the rails, and it'll only take the same amount of effort to lift the carriages back onto the right tracks as it will to put them back on the wrong ones. So, what is it? What is that one bug in society that I believe is at the heart of everything that's wrong? I usually refer to it as individualism, by which I mean the mentality of every person for themselves. It's the combination of selfishness, greed, and zero-sum competition that's codified into capitalism, which justifies the exploitation of others and the planet. It's an ideology that's been elevated to the status of religion here in the US, but like most Westerners, New Zealanders are also indoctrinated into it. Individualism teaches us, paradoxically, that each of us is more important than everyone else, that the good of the one outweighs the good of the many, that our happiness and success naturally come at the expense of others, and that we shouldn't feel bad about that. This kind of thinking leads people to develop a sense of entitlement. And the flip side of this zero-sum thinking is that our unhappiness and our failures must therefore be someone else's fault, which leads to polarization and tribalism. If humanity is even going to survive for the next few generations, we need to undergo a huge cultural shift away from individualism and towards a sense of collective responsibility, interdependence, and cooperation. I try to approach everything with a scientific mindset. It's the most effective way to overcome cognitive biases and prejudices, which our brains are hardwired with by evolution for survival. These cognitive biases and our intellectual and behavioral flaws are almost all evolutionarily advantageous at some point. They kept our ancestors alive. Greed was a valuable survival strategy when there were abundant resources and very few humans. But that's no longer the case. We don't need to be greedy to survive anymore. In fact, now we need to not be greedy to survive. Greed is making us unhealthy and destroying the planet. When a saber-toothed tiger attacked a caveman's family, it was a good thing that the caveman quickly flew into a rage and was able to scare the tiger off. His children survived, and so did his short-tempered genes. 10,000 years later, the short temper that his descendants have inherited is something that they need to make an effort to suppress in order to be good parents themselves and to function in polite society. Our brains are more sophisticated than our ancestors were, and more importantly, we have access to so much more information. We can overcome these biases and these behavioral flaws if we acknowledge them and if we apply objective reasoning. But that only works if we can trust the information we're presented with. With the internet, we invented a technology that makes the sum total of all human knowledge available to us at our fingertips, and then we allow that same technology to be used to disseminate manipulative disinformation. So just when we most need good sources of information is exactly when we're also facing a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. And of course, it's not just whether we can trust the information we receive, it's also whether we can trust the companies who collect our information. I'm thinking of two in particular. One of these companies has recognized that as they ask us for more and more of our personal information and biometrics, as they ingratiate themselves deeper into our lives, they have to constantly prove how seriously they take our privacy and security. And they charge us a lot of money for the comfort that that affords. The other company says the words privacy and security occasionally, but in the meantime has learned enough about us to predict our behavior better than we can predict ourselves. And instead of charging us money, is selling our attention to all of the biggest liars for billions of dollars. But the algorithm that drives all that manipulation and exploitation wasn't written by anyone in Silicon Valley. The algorithm that corrupted social media is capitalism, the same algorithm that's turned everything we humans do into a winner-take-all competition. It's pretty clear to me that if these platforms didn't have to pay huge dividends to their shareholders, their algorithms could prioritize what we see based on what would benefit us, rather than what benefits advertisers. Do you remember the emergence of social media? When it was fresh and new and seemingly a powerful force for good? It was supposed to democratize publishing and broadcasting, and it ended up literally democratizing whole countries. During the Arab Spring uprisings, social media led directly to the overthrow of a bunch of evil dictators in the Middle East. And look, social media hasn't completely ceased being a force for good. The Me Too movement is another social media-driven phenomenon and an example of how fast and how fundamentally society can change now that we're all so well connected. We still have a long way to go before we can claim to have achieved equality. Me Too and Black Lives Matter and others have once again proven the power of the truth. And when people are open to hearing one another's truth, that leads to empathy and to increased fairness. And that is why I think it's so important that virtual reality doesn't become corrupted by capitalism like social media has. We can't let one company be the gatekeeper of VR, and we can't let advertising be the way that it's monetized. That's why I think it's so important that organizations like Burning Man and Lost Horizon are migrating their mass social experiments out of the physical festival environment and into VR. In VR, these culture jamming initiatives can be even more accessible and inclusive. We can more rapidly prototype and iterate on new social and economic models and decision-making paradigms. And the VR industry holds the keys to a medium of immersive, intimate, evocative, transformative storytelling. It's both our privilege and our duty to create content and to tell stories that inspire people with the possibility of a future that is equally accessible to all, radically inclusive, intentionally fair, and indefinitely sustainable. I'm constantly amazed by how many important and meaningful stories are told in VR, from powerful documentaries on challenging subjects to thought-provoking fiction and games. The motivation to do good is strong in this community. I know that if we can expand the audience for these stories, we can open people's minds and we can have a positive impact on the world. Besides that, there are a number of things that set the VR industry apart from the rest of the startup community and from the business world in general. We are a community of self-selected pioneers and dreamers who've mostly chosen to forego getting rich quick to instead work in a challenging and progressive industry that we're passionate about. We're a new industry that doesn't have an established elite nor a legacy of systemic bias. That means that we can and we should model inclusivity in the teams we assemble and the products and services we offer. By making diversity the prime directive of our hiring strategies, and by designing everything we make with everyone in mind, we can show other industries the way forward. We're an open, supportive, collaborative community that understands that a rising tide lifts all boats. So we're uniquely positioned to demonstrate the benefits of business models and intellectual property policies that are rooted in cooperation and mutual innovation rather than competition and protectionism. We are the one industry that is best positioned to work, collaborate, and gather remotely. We can demonstrate how to massively reduce the number of miles driven and flown without a loss of productivity. But we shouldn't just be constrained to thinking of this as a solution to COVID-19 because it allows us to address climate change, diversity, and accessibility. We can use our expertise to ensure that our industry and all the industries we serve are more inclusive and sustainable. Late last year, for the first time ever, the Venice VR program was made available virtually for anyone with appropriate headsets. In past years, only a small number of people who were lucky enough to have the time and money and were able to travel to Venice in person have had the privilege to experience all of the groundbreaking VR pieces that are showcased there. The same is true of every other VR festival, and in my opinion, this perennial lack of access has been a huge impediment to the advancement of the medium of VR. It's deprived the majority of VR creators from the opportunity to be inspired by and learn from the latest of each other's work. We're still at the beginning of figuring out how to make VR as polished as TV and film. The only way we're going to get the medium to live up to the promise that I believe it has is by experimenting collectively and building upon each other's progress. Not just a privileged few, but all of us. I like to think that the increased accessibility this year, and hopefully from now on, will usher in a golden age of advancements in VR storytelling. And, given the power of virtual reality storytelling, to allow people to look past their own biases and to see the world through one another's eyes, and given the tendency of VR storytellers to tell important and meaningful stories, I expect this golden age of VR storytelling to contribute to a transition to a more inclusive, fair, and sustainable future. Thank you very much.